Well, for those who are not used to what happens on the day of our annual business meeting, I usually deliver at all three services something I call the State of the Parish Sermon instead of doing a State of the Parish speech at the business meeting. So this is a little bit different than what I usually preach, but not all that much different, actually. Somewhat. That's just an excuse. Today we hear in the Gospel, "Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them." Now, from a modern perspective, it's hard to not at least have a wry smile at the end of verse 31. Simon's mother-in-law is bedridden with a fever 1 minute, the next minute she's healed, and the next she's up making sandwiches. A common question I've heard is, why doesn't Simon make his own, expletive deleted, sandwiches? And that's a good question. But I think it'd be off topic for me to delve into questions of gender roles in first century Jewish Palestine. But there are some important things to note in the reading, even at its face value. The Greek word for serve is the same one used earlier in the gospel when the angels are serving Jesus in the wilderness. And it's the same one used later on when Jesus talks about his mission that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Simon's mother-in-law is not just making food. She's participating in the ministry of angels and Jesus himself. Beloved, I've been here as your pastor 10 years. I only noticed that by accident right around the turn of the year when the math finally hit me. It's been a time of joy for my family and I. We love this church community and the greater Waukesha community of which we're a part. It's also been a time of challenge. As I noted last year, when I arrived, our attendance was half of what it had been in 2001, and we had 1/3 the number of pledging families. While struggles around human sexuality had something to do with this, the statistics show that the drop started several years before that, and this drop is congruent with what studies from the Pew Research Center show as a changing pattern of church participation in American society. For a period of time from about 1945 to at least the late 1980s, churches of all types were growing by leaps and bounds as the institution became part of the glue the returning World War II veterans used to build a society on the foundations of the New Deal. The returning veterans and their Rosie the Riveter wives created a society of joiners. They revitalized old organizations and created new ones to support the structured and hierarchical society that mirrored that of the military with which they had defeated Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito. Everyone voted, and everyone attended church. In his 1959 book, The Status Seekers, social critic Vance Packard describes the religious culture of the time. America, we keep reading, is undergoing a tremendous religious renaissance. Membership is growing by 1 million a year and is now up to more than 104 million. Per-member contributions are up. Nearly $1 billion worth of new structures are going up in the United States each year. But everything started to change in the 1990s as that generation began to pass away. The social expectations and advantages of church membership have faded, but churches are left with organizations that were designed for a time of constant growth. Churches are often ill-equipped to deal with membership decline as church-going returns to more historic American levels. Also, the society has changed in other ways. Sunday morning has become, for better or worse, just another day of the week for activities. Parents, including my wife and I, often have to make a choice between church attendance on a given Sunday and a mandatory event for a child's club or school. While we might be tempted to bemoan this, I try to remind people that this is what it has always been like for Jews or Muslims in America, whose weekly worship has always included this kind of choice. In this rapidly changing cultural environment, the struggle for St. Matthias has been to continue to respond faithfully. One has to remember that continual numerical growth is an American obsession, not necessarily a Christian one. God calls us to go out into the world and proclaim the good news, to visit the sick and those in prison, and to help the poor. Numerical growth may or may not result from that, but true growth as the people of God cannot happen unless that is our primary goal. Abigail Van Buren, the original Dear Abby, once wrote, "The church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints." We are all, every one of us, in the place of Simon's mother-in-law. We are, as a species, afflicted with a fever, the human fevers of greed, and hate and violence. Jesus is the good physician who reaches out to us, takes us by the hand, and lifts us up. He then tells us to go and do likewise. We're to be the loving hands of Christ to the world. We are to be lifted out of our fevered dreams of wealth and power and privilege and serve like the angels. I could enumerate the ways we've adapted to our new reality, but I'd rather focus on one area in which St. Matthias has helped change the entire Waukesha community over these last 10 years. In the winter of 2007, 2 homeless men froze to death in their cars on the streets of Waukesha. In the winter of 2008, Bernie Juneau, the executive director of Hebron House of Hospitality, approached me about using our basement as a temporary warming shelter for the homeless men whose population had increased exponentially due to the recession. After consulting the wardens and vestry, we readily agreed. I naively thought that no one would have a problem with us running a shelter in a church basement, especially since we're using skilled and trained Hebron House staff. It was then that I first heard the trope I heard over and over during the next year or so. Waukesha doesn't have any homeless. They all come from Milwaukee or Chicago, where they're loaded on buses and brought north where they know they can get a better deal. I'm not kidding, I heard that story over and over. Never mind that supposed better deal had meant death on the streets the previous year. Both private citizens and elected officials seem to echo this misconception. After struggles with zoning and fire code, we operated the shelter in the basement for 2 years. The most useful outcome from it was the collected statistics, which showed that a supermajority of those served were Waukesha residents. And these statistics became the basis for a county-wide discussion, including local government, churches, nonprofits, and the United Way, that identified the role the community had to play in winter shelter. While this process continued, the Association of Waukesha Churches, which had been reformed to address this very issue, continued to provide funding and facilities as a witness to our belief that this was God's will for us. At the end of the process, it was finally decided that the Housing Action Coalition of Waukesha had the authority and the responsibility to provide this shelter. For the last 2 winters, this organization that represents governmental, NGO, and faith groups has run the shelter, and there's now a good possibility that a permanent location for this facility can be purchased and renovated. In 10 years, we have gone from outright denial that this issue existed to the entire community taking responsibility for it. Had it not been for our continuous, dogged, faithful response and those of the other churches, no change might have ever taken place. It is likely that people are alive today due to this witness. Jesus reaches out to us and pulls us up, and when we dare to do the same, he is pulling with us. In the book of Acts, when Jesus ascends to heaven, angels appear and ask the disciples, "Why do you stand looking up towards heaven?" Now, it's obvious why they're looking, but the angels are reminding them that their task is on earth, among human culture and politics and religion. Miracles don't always look like walking on water. Sometimes they look like 35 beds in a church basement. As to our future, I'm not sure what it holds. The culture continues to spin and change around us. The spirit of American life has become even more divided and belligerent in the last few years. What I do know is that Jesus is still reaching out to us, offering to heal us from the fever of our human madness, and we're asked to do the same, reaching out in Jesus' name. I'm not sure where this is going to happen next. It will probably be much like the shelter in 2008, when something seems obvious and small, but then bears a harvest 10 or 100-fold. We will continue to worship God, giving thanks for the generosity of our forebears and keeping this hospital for sinners looking outward. Jesus will continue to reach out, take our hands, and raise us up. Then we will serve. Amen.